Hello, everyone, and welcome to Community Central video. This morning, we are going to be discussing foundations, particularly foundations and the trademark and branding services that they offer for open source projects. We have with us a panel of leaders from 5 different major open source foundations. Not everybody, of course, but they give you a good idea, are going to give you a good idea of what's available for foundations and how they can help you with protecting your project's identity and other things. Now, before we get started, a few things. First of all, we will be taking questions from the audience. In order to ask questions of our panelists, please use that Q&A pane in your browser. I ask the questions you want to ask there. If you see questions that someone else has asked that also want answered, please upvote them. In general, we'll be taking the most upvoted questions first, provided they're not duplicative of something that has already been answered. We will answer as many questions as we can on screen, but we won't get to all of them. This session is being recorded. It will go up on the Community Central, on the Red Hat Community YouTube channel in a few hours. So if you miss part of it, if you want to revisit part of it or share it with your colleagues, that is the place to share it. And as always, you can go to communitycentral.tv to look for previous videos or upcoming episodes. So today we're going to start out by introducing our panelists. So I very briefly, if each of you can introduce yourself, which foundation you are part of, and your role there, and say something and briefly summarize in like a couple of sentences what foundation, what trademark and branding services you offer projects, your foundation offers projects, if any. And I'm going to go in the sort of random order that people got distributed on my version of the screen. So Shane, do you want to start?
Hi, I'm Shane Kirkrew. I currently volunteer as the Vice Chairman of the Apache Software Foundation. And perhaps more interestingly for this discussion, I was the first Vice President of Brand Management for the ASF 10 plus years ago, and was the first and at the point in time only person to really write a full trademark policy for a foundation that I'm aware of at that point. In terms of the ASF or the Apache Software Foundation, hopefully we all know the basics. In terms of trademarks and branding, the ASF provides basic education, right? We have a detailed policy set. We have some basics for how projects should present themselves and should use whatever brand they want to make. They come up with their own brand, of course. We provide registration services. So if a project wants to register their trademark, we'll do that after some discussion. And we provide basic access to some counsel in terms of when a project has an issue with somebody misusing their brand, then we indeed have some counsel we can work with through the Vice President of Brand Management, who is now Mark Thomas. So that's the basics of what Apache does. And the one other note is the one requirement we do have at Apache is every project will be named Apache project name. So that's sort of the one requirement. Beyond that, it's up to them what they want to do for their brand. Thanks.
Okay, Amy?
Hi, my name is Amy Marrich. I'm a Principal Technical Marketing Manager here at Red Hat, but I serve on the OpenStack board as an individual board member. In other words, I'm elected from the community to represent them. So I don't represent Red Hat on the board, I represent all my other community members, which is a bit of a distinction there. As far as trademark and branding, we provide identity creation and branding services for the different projects, and we are not just OpenStack anymore. We have Kata containers, Airship, Starling X, Zool, and we will be announcing a new one that we've been working on in October And part of the services is naming, which we don't require Apache or anything in front of ours. It's whatever the groups decided to put it, their name, logo design, web and print materials, and basically any other brand assets or marketing they need. On the legal side, we do have lawyers that if there's an issue, the project can come to us and we'll make sure that anything is resolved that needs to be resolved.
Thank you. So, Chris?
Hello, all. My name is Chris Aniszczyk. I, as part of my kind of day job, I work as CTO of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which is part of the Linux Foundation umbrella of organizations. We have a essentially blanket, trademark policy across the whole organization, but the level of services tends to differ across, the various sub-foundations. For C and CF, for example, we have kind of in-house logo design, branding type services to help projects come up with a logo and brand identity that we could go trademark for them. We also have in-house counsel, helps assist projects, especially if they're trying to choose a name that is possible to trademark. We also have external counsel that we work with when issues arise. But in general, we kind of offer the basics for our projects. When kind of another thing that we offer is, there's, you have a project name, which generally is identity for a project, but sometimes projects have a desire to kind of build a custom brand around like conformance, for example, like Kubernetes with certified Kubernetes. So we offer the ability to offer kind of custom conformance programs that are properly trademark branded and protected also as a benefit. So that's it, but very similar to kind of what, OpenStack does as Amy went over.
Thank you. Van?
Hi, I'm Van Lindberg. I am General Counsel and one of the directors of the Python Software Foundation. The PSF is a little bit different than some of the other foundations that have talked, is that we are less of an umbrella than perhaps some of the others. Especially, we're probably most similar to OpenStack in terms of the scope of things that we cover. That said, we have become increasingly active in terms of helping manage trademark issues for projects in the Python ecosystem, because it started out as just straight up Python, but as the scope of what the community has asked the foundation to do has grown, and as we have started to support other projects in the Python ecosystem, we have developed essentially community branding guidelines and trademark policies that start to apply to anything that essentially officially comes under our umbrella. The other thing is that we have been particularly active in terms of because we're of the unique way in which the PSF grew up. A lot of our trademarks are not just associated with the projects, but they're also associated with the events and the services that we provide. For example, PyCon is one of our most active trademarks, as well as PyPI for serving packages, serving Python libraries for various people, and PyLadies, which is again part of the user group as opposed to just a project.
Thank you. And Mike.
All right, somebody has to go last. Yeah, and I guess that's the rate I joined into. So Eclipse, my name is Mike Milinkovich. I'm the executive director of the Eclipse Foundation. That's been there for 16 years. We have a host of trademark services, and it's really runs the gamut. So first of all, we are an umbrella organization similar to the Apache Software Foundation in many ways. Jane actually helped us draft our trademark guidelines, or a revision to our trademark guidelines some years ago. But we have a couple of different slots. So for our projects, our open source projects, we actually manage them quite similarly to the Apache Software Foundation in the sense that every Eclipse project also says Eclipse in front of it. So it's Eclipse Jetty or Eclipse Vertex in the first and most prominent use. And so that's very similar. But then we also have working groups, which are sort of mini consortia of like-minded organizations and people that want to focus on a particular domain, and they can actually have their own marks. And it may or may not include the word Eclipse in it at all. So in some cases we have like Eclipse IoT is one example, and we have just starting up now MicroProfile is sort of another example. In addition to that, we also do specifications, compliance programs. So a couple of years ago, it was announced that Oracle was going to move Java EE to the Eclipse Foundation under Jakarta, what became Jakarta EE, and we had to recreate basically a new and modern specification process to supplant the role of the JCP in setting Java EE standards or specifications. And so we also have compliance programs around that. So we will, for projects, we will help them in numerous ways in terms of first providing common law protection for their trademarks, perhaps registering them if the project becomes sort of important enough, whatever your definition of important is. We'll also provide logo design services for our projects. So if somebody is like, hey, we need a cool logo for our project, there's a couple of different ways that we can help. And the other thing I just turn back on registration is we actually have basically a registered trademark agent full-time on staff who will help register our trademarks in multiple classes around the world, depending on the need of the project or the working group.
Cool, well, thank you. Okay, let's get on to some more detailed questions. So for our first question, does your foundation have a uniform trademark usage policy, or does it vary by the project or trademark? And we're going to take Shane first for this one.
Hi. Yes, we have a uniform policy that applies to all 200 plus of our top-level projects, and essentially applies to all of the 350 or so individual software products. So some project of community may release multiple products with different names. Same policy applies to all. So having it be Apache Lucene or Apache Solar is a key part of tying them all together to the ASF, especially given that we're all volunteer, right? Our entire structure is volunteer on our side. And that helps ensure that Apache can help any of the projects, immaterially of how connected they are otherwise to the rest of our projects or our communities. The brand goes along with it. That's part of our brand, the way we build projects. So that is consistent everywhere. And essentially in terms of the licensing, the only difference is the Apache word itself and Apache Con, much like PyCon, and our feather we're very sensitive about those words or symbols specifically because they represent the foundation as a whole. But otherwise, the policy is the same for every project. So pretty easy.
Thank you. Okay, Mike?
Yeah, so well, it wouldn't be any big surprise. Shane helped us draft our project for trademark guidelines. Basically everything he said for Apache is similar for our projects at the Eclipse Foundation. So it's very similar, and we use the word Eclipse, and it's uniform across all of our projects. Where it gets a little bit more interesting, if you will, is around things like the working groups and specifications and compliance programs or compatibility programs, because in those cases you need to have the freedom to meet the needs of a particular community or the business requirements of a particular compatibility mark or certification mark. And so what we do is in those cases, we basically, with review by council with the Eclipse Foundation, each working group that's building a specification and an associated certification program has the freedom to stipulate their own requirements, and we will basically custom build a program that matches their needs. It's really clear that there's a lot of variety in that space and a lot of different interests and business requirements, and so you need the flexibility to deal with the different scenarios as they come up.
Thanks. And speaking of variety, Chris.
Hey, how's it going? I mean, similar to folks mentioned before, like we have a blanket policy that basically covers all kind of LF related projects. If you go to the footer of any kind of LF project, you'll generally see like, yada, yada, copyright, all Kubernetes authors to, trademark usage policy where you go, read the details of that. On top of that kind of blanket policy, we do have, specifically crafted policies for projects that either implement like a conformance program or have just like unique considerations. The Linux mark has existed for kind of a long time and is stewarded by the Linux Foundation, previously Linux Mark Institute and so on. And that has its own kind of, very specific rules. But we generally work with our communities, kind of craft what is best for their specific needs. But I think we manage something in the order of 800 to 900 marks now worldwide.
Thank you. So, next question. So trademark protections are obviously not the only service a foundation or open source trade organization will provide. Extending beyond the realm of legal, what do you see as the key benefit of working with foundations in the open source ecosystem? So Amy, you want to tackle this one?
Yeah, so with the OpenStack Foundation, we've got all the projects underneath us. And like I mentioned earlier, we do the marketing. So one thing we did beyond just the project logos and branding, we have project branding. So like every OpenStack project has its own little mascot and you can identify with them, and you go to the summit and everyone's trading stickers so that it helps spread what we're doing and love for the different projects, which is kind of unique and kind of fun. So beyond just logos and branding and stuff, OpenStack does provide infrastructure, and a lot of it's paid for and some of it's donated, and it allows the different projects to run through CI/CD, which is actually running on one of our projects, Zool. So it allows, one thing we say with Zool is don't merge broken code. So first the code runs through Zool and it makes sure that it is good for that code base, but then it checks it against the whole larger code base. So those are some extra things that if you were just a little individual project, not that Nova is little, but say you were just Nova and you ran it and you approved it and you're like, yay, my Nova code works. But then when you went to merge it, you found out it wouldn't work with Neutron, which is our networking. That would be a big issue. So having those type of infrastructure and larger level umbrella type things are very important, especially in a project this large. And the other projects, one of the things the OpenStack Foundation has done is let them choose their own path. They still use the same, infrastructure and other things, but no one's telling them you need to do Git and Garrett, which I love Garrett. I don't understand why anyone wouldn't use Garrett, but so all the products are a little different and they have their freedom to be their own way.
Thank you. So Shane, the same question?
Yeah, the two things I would say, one is community leadership and mentoring, right? It's not a lot of other places have like a community manager position, but a lot of that, that certainly helps the community learn to communicate better and to be more organized about working on this thing we're all separately working on together. But really community mentoring in terms of really working with the individuals and, trying to train them and help them out in the general sense of how do I get better at open source in whether it's my project or your project or in a project over in Eclipse, right? There's a lot of that along with that and the governance, right? The question of instead of having to reinvent how to make a project management committee or a technical management committee, right? We've got tons of examples right here in front of us. Don't try and reinvent the wheel. One of the ones we offer is certainly going to be a good solution for you, and we have people who can explain them, right? That saves a lot of time in the community organizing to get people being productive together on writing their code, rather than saying, oh, I've got a great idea, and then sort of doing great ideas, but not doing the collaboration. And I'll push back on your question one thing. You're saying everything besides legal. One of the incredibly valuable things about all of our foundations is the legal hat to hang things on. And it doesn't seem like it's that big a deal, and it isn't right now, but sometime in the future for your great idea, having some place that can say, oh yes, we can register your mark. Yes, we can register your copyright, right? We can help you with licensing questions. Those things are all incredibly helpful, and redesigning them is a lot of work. Saying.
Thank you. So, Chris, anything to add to that?
I mean, I totally agree with Shane that legal is one of the kind of the most valuable things that are offered by a foundation. With CNCF, it's a little bit more, complicated where, I think a lot of people don't realize Linux Foundation as a whole is probably about 200 professional staff employed that support a variety of these projects. And a lot of the services that each organization gets from the LF kind of varies depending on their needs. So there's things like, lawyers, there's program management to help with, governance advice, setting up meetings, and all sorts of kind of good hygiene that you need to run an open source project. There's sometimes tech writers available, DevRel folks, an amazing, one of the best, I think, events teams for open source events in the business. And we've done events for not only our projects, but sometimes other organizations out there, such as the Apache Foundation, or other kind of open source focused organizations, because events are kind of a great way to kind of bring your community, together, and that's something super valuable to do. We have other kind of things like, summer code as a service type thing, because what great way to kind of empower and grow your community by mentoring folks through internships. For those that are like dealing with global issues, we have the ability to kind of register things in China, Japan, and others. I don't know if anyone has ever tried to acquire a WeChat handle for a project. It's a bit of an adventure, but that's something we could kind of help with. So that's basically the kind of the gamut. It's kind of a breadth, and it really varies between organization, because each project is kind of unique and different and needs different level of services.
Thank you. So, how does your foundation address the enforcement of trademarks across national boundaries, like internationally? Since obviously open source is global. Van, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, this is something that is actually a current issue that we are dealing with in the PSF right now. A lot of times I find that what will happen is, you don't see this very often, I think, in the United States, but I think in a number of other countries, particularly ones that don't have this idea of you get some rights just by using it. It is whoever files first gets the trademark. I think that you see a lot of people who are just wanting to make a buck who decide, hey, I can register this particular name, I can register this thing, and I can set myself up as either to get a bunch of advertising or to try and set myself up as the official X, the official Python in our case, in a particular country. And it ends up actually being a big issue. One of the ones that we're dealing with right now is actually in Japan, where somebody decided that they wanted to register the term Python in one of the classes, one of the classes that we use, class 9. For those for whom that was just a bunch of gibberish, all international trademarks are separated according to what they cover. That's why you can have both a Delta Airlines and a Delta Faucets, and they don't compete with each other. Those are called classes. And so in this case, they started saying they want to be the only Python trainer and Python master. And so because at that point, they started doing this when we had not yet fully matured our application in Japan, simply because it takes a little longer and it sometimes goes slow. And so we've had to actually fight this and file an invalidation against their trademark on the grounds that they were not the first ones using it. They're actually trying to take advantage of the work that we had done. This is I mentioned, though, that there are some cases, particularly some countries like China, this happens, Brazil, this happens, where even if you were the prior user, if you don't get in your trademark first, then you may have just lost the opportunity to have that trademark in that particular country if you don't actually file for it. That actually presents a real difficulty for a lot of projects, and this is why I agree with the comments in the last question about why legal can be one of the best things that legal support can be one of the best services that are provided by a foundation. And the reason is because those are the sorts of things that you don't necessarily think of, and you don't necessarily have especially the individual capacity to deal with, but can be taken on by something like a foundation and just allow your project to grow and your community to grow internationally. So how do you decide where you want to enforce? Because it can be very, very expensive, because every single country wants their own to be paid for their own little registration. The way that we've been doing it is we have a track of where we have user groups and where we have conferences. And if we have a user group and a conference, and either multiple user groups or a conference, we put that on the list of a country where we should file for and maintain a trademark.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's a little complicated. And Mike, apparently you are dealing with how it's a little complicated right now.
Yeah, so first of all, I want to say I completely agree with everything Van just said. When you talk about, it's really hard to explain to somebody who hasn't been in this world, but trying to explain the complexity of, okay, I have a project name, woohoo! All right, now what classes do you want to register that in? What countries do you want to register that in? Right, the spreadsheet just explodes, and of course the cost explodes when once you become prominent and important and you need to register in multiple classes in multiple countries. And some of these can be really expensive. I mean, like, for an EU registration for each class, you're probably talking, is it 2,400 euros, I think, per class. So it's complex. It requires ongoing management because there's renewals on top of everything else. There's also requirements to provide exhibits or specimens to demonstrate that, yes, you can prove that you're actually using this mark in this class, in this way, in that country, or in at least a way that can be reached in that country. So it's incredibly complex. And so one of the things that we're going through at the moment that kind of adds to this is the Eclipse Foundation is in the process of moving to Europe. So we've been relying, so the Eclipse Foundation has been a Delaware incorporated US legal entity for its 16-year existence, and we're in the process of moving to become a Belgium international nonprofit association. And so one of the things you really get into there is we've been relying for many years, certainly for our project trademarks, on what's called common law, is what Van says. Chris, I think, said, you just start using it and you have some rights in that name just because you're using it. And that just that flat out doesn't work in Europe. If it's not registered, it doesn't exist. And so we're, building up working towards having, first of all, moving for the registrations we've got to move the legal entity that owns those marks from the US to Belgium. And there's literally, that's hundreds of pieces of paper that have to be shuffled around. And God knows how many powers of attorney to make that possible. And then gradually become into a situation where we haven't even really worked this out yet, but what are we going to do about the fact that now that we're in Belgium and, generally speaking, common law just plain doesn't work there. And I think that's, so there's some really interesting, interesting in air quotes, right? Challenges that go along with a move like this.
Okay. Chris, did you have anything to add to that?
Van and Mike have nailed it. I think people don't realize that trademark law is super complicated globally. It's like laughably, it makes copyright almost look like laughably simple in some ways in terms of dealing it. I think people don't understand how trademark law kind of works, with the difference, of jurisdictions and classes out there. The expense could be very expensive. A lot of open source foundations tend to rely on just like the common law rights, but for the Linux Foundation and some of our organizations, we actually do register depending on how the project deems itself and maybe the level of importance to it and kind of risk for abuse globally. We'll actually go register the mark all over the world in tier 1, tier 2, and all these different types of countries, and it adds up very quickly. Like, I think it's probably maybe $2,000 per class per jurisdiction on average if you kind of average it across the world, and that could add up significantly. And that doesn't even recognize the cost of part of trademark law. If you're not policing things, there's potential of abandonment and so on, and so you could potentially lose the rights to the mark if you're not actively taking care of it. So it's completely a wild situation, but I totally agree with Van and Mike that it's complicated, and I think foundations for the last 20 plus years actually have kind of been doing a great job in really doing this on a global scale, in my opinion.
Actually, if I could add one thing, there's one topic that we haven't really touched on yet, which is trademarks are unlike copyrights and patents in that they are a use it or lose it kind of proposition, or more accurately, a defend it or lose it proposition.
Yes,
it's expensive.
And so when we talk about policing your trademarks, I mean, if you want to keep your trademark valid, if you find somebody who is basically infringing your mark, you must go do something. And so that's a whole other axis of complexity that we haven't really touched on so far.
I don't want to extend this topic, but I do need to add one factual correction from the council that I've spoken to. At least in the US, Mike isn't really correct when he says you must police things to maintain your mark. It's very complicated, but it's something that, unless you're really, really big, I don't think most people here need to worry about. But the way trademark law works is it's not common sense. So having any one of our foundations or somebody like us to help advise you when it's really important to do X, or when you really should do X, but not the big deal, is a key win for any project. So sorry for that little interruption there.
So I'm going to jump in on this one too. I didn't think that you necessarily thought you were going to be touching off controversy at this spot. First of all, I want to. Yes, while I agree with what Shane said in terms of that trademark law is complicated, but if you were going to boil it down to a one sentence summary that is going to be the rule of thumb, defend it or lose it is probably a better rule of thumb than maybe you don't have to do anything, because that is one of the key issues actually with open source and trademarks is the fact that you do have to do something, because if you allow people to use it too openly, what happens is that you can engage in something called naked licensing. Now, this is not an issue everywhere, but if you don't have sufficient quality control around the way in which the mark is used, then a court, upon it being challenged, can say, well, you didn't really get your mark to stand for something, because a mark is really about a brand. It is a signifier of a source. And so that's, for example, why it's so important that the mark represents the brand, the source of the code, the source of to a certain extent, it represents the Apache Foundation or the Eclipse Foundation, as well as the particular project leaders. And if you are not using it in such a way that it becomes a good signifier of that source, a court can say, well, in which case anyone can use it. And that has happened in some high profile cases, although not in open source.
Okay, thanks for that addition. So we're going to go to some audience questions. So remember, signal me if you want to answer a particular audience question. I'm going to start off with a question from Ben Fisher, which is, do you provide any trainings on trademark branding related issues to your projects? It looks like Amy wants to start with that one.
Well, I personally didn't take it as training on trademarks, so I'm going to address it on how we do training for the community. I mean, pre-summit and also at Open Infra Days, we do something called OpenStack Upstream Institute, which goes over governance and how to configure your systems for Git and Gerrit and all the accounts you need, and how to find information about who's on your TC and so on. So I think it is important to do what you can as a foundation to help onboard new contributors, because sometimes it can be a little intimidating if you don't know someone in the community to ask that first question on IRC. So we try to make it as easy as possible, and also we'll get PTLs and others to help with the training, so you already know someone before you go out and try to do your first commit.
Okay. Does anybody else want to answer that? Shane?
Yeah, just briefly, the ASF, since we're an all-volunteer organization, we have plenty of trainings. I put one into the Q&A area there just as an example. We have plenty available on our websites. We have some speakers like myself who give both community training, which is really key for getting people engaged in how to do the community, how to collaborate, but also for trademarks in particular. But the issue at Apache is we're all volunteers, so we have the work out there. We actually have a project called Community Development, which is just a group of 20, 30 plus volunteers who want to help bring you into the community. That provides materials like this. We actually have a brand new project called Apache Training that's working on sort of the tools for building training. But again, those are all volunteer-led, right? So it's available out there, but it's not like we bring everybody into this as a new committer at an Apache project. We don't have the scale for that, unlike some other groups might have.
Okay, Chris, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I do. So we have a lot of kind of open source compliance focused training. It's mostly compliance related, ensuring teaching developers are copyright compliance and so on. There's very little that covers trademarks, and specifically, I would love to change that in the future and even make it potentially mandatory with my evil hat on. For making the lives of maintainers maybe a little bit more difficult, but I'll share the course in the chat for at least compliance, which is super useful for folks. But I think everyone in this room could do more to train open source developers on these kind of complex topics.
Hey, Van?
Yeah, tying it just a little bit to trademark. One of the things that we require for any conference that brands itself with the PyCon branding, PyCon UK, PyCon US, PyCon wherever, is that they have a code of conduct, and we have held code of conduct trainings for various conference organizers so that they can understand how to respond to issues that come up in conferences. That hasn't been as much of an issue this year for various reasons, but that is a training that is in part designed to help maintain the value of the mark, although there are other good reasons for doing it as well.
Thank you. So another question, and I'm going to paraphrase a bit because I know Karsten and I know what he's getting at here. So how do you handle sort of sub-brands or logos to permit community creativity? That is, say, communities making their own versions of logos for a user group or a subgroup of the community and using your trademark in order to do community promotion without themselves needing to spend a lot of time needing to interact with attorneys. How does that work within your foundation?
I'll go first.
Yep.
All right. So one example. There's actually two things. One is, first of all, when it comes to project logos, we at the Eclipse Foundation basically don't have an opinion. So if a project wants to create a funky logo, then that's totally within their discretion, and that's part of being a project. The more interesting scenario is one that we just went through recently with as part of standing up Jakarta EE and getting more about building around a community around enterprise Java. We started to get requests for effectively user groups in being able to name themselves as the Jakarta EE China user group. And in that case, what we did is we actually created a very lightweight licensing agreement to help enable that, to avoid the sort of the naked licensing scenario that Van was referring to earlier. And so that's and I can't remember exactly. I think we just basically shamelessly stole a GNOME document to start from, if my memory serves me correctly. And by the way, we have lots of various licensing agreements sitting on our website, and if somebody wants to pick those up and reuse them for your own purposes, feel free to do so. So there's licensing reuse as well as code reuse out there. And so, but the point is that we go as far as we can to enable creative reuse of our marks, while being very careful to not either run afoul of either abandonment or naked licensing. And so it is a kind of a fine line to walk, but generally speaking, the solution is to have a nice, simple, lightweight license agreement that enables the community to do what they want to do with the mark, and then kind of get out of the way.
So I posted this in the Q&A as well, but I think that the PSF's way of addressing this is actually somewhat unique, that we have defined very carefully some things that must be maintained in our mark and some things that have a scope for creativity. An example is what we call the two snakes logo. This is the Python logo. It has two interlocking snakes. We actually have defined that in terms of its shape only. And we've said that as long as the outline is consistent, you can fill it in or surround it in ways that you desire. And so what that has allowed people to do is you'll see user groups that are, you'll see user groups that fill it in with their local flag, or with or from colors from their flag, or that they will put some things around it that are representative of their local community or their local user group. And as long as it doesn't touch the outline, or the outline is exactly the same and clearly perceptible, we have allowed that. Another place where we are doing that is in the PyLadies logo, where it's this sort of stylized picture of a woman, and she has these glasses and this nose, and one of the things that we're trying to define is what exactly is the protectable part of this, and it ends up being essentially the glasses and the nose, because the hair changes, whether there's a hat changes, different colors of hair, and so we're trying to actually to define, here's the protectable piece, and then here are the areas for creativity.
I think I'll try to be brief and provide a comparison. I think one of the differences here is that Apache is a very large organization with, comparatively to at least most of our speakers here, a very small resource pool. So we don't have any lawyers on staff, right? We have counsel from another company who work with us. Apache, as you know, we have 300 plus total projects that we have communities that ship, and a total of maybe 12 employees, right? And most of those are sysadmins. So the thing that I did when I wrote Apache's trademark policy is that defines that Apache Hadoop, right, is only about our software. We effectively only work on class 9, right? We provide software products for the common good. And beyond that, as long as you're referring to our software as Apache Hadoop, then here are some guidelines for good ways that you can make your user group or run your conference, right? We have an event policy says if you want to run a conference about Hadoop, you can do it using a certain naming format, follow these requirements, ask our VP for permission, link back to our project, right? Make sure that you can have an event that's great, but make sure it's about Apache Hadoop, not about somebody else's software that's built on top of ours. So we sort of have a different policy because that's all that we can realistically police and help our projects do. And fundamentally for us, it's really, we just provide the software products, right? A lot of other foundations have, user groups built in, or as a clear ally, they have the certification areas, right? Where that's a lot more work. We don't have the capacity for that. So I think there's a difference there. And for a lot of projects, some of those details, right? Unless you get to a certain scale, those aren't going to be important unless somebody comes along and tries to make a problem. And that's always the tricky part, right? Think of trademarks as insurance, right? You hope something doesn't happen. If it does, if you have a strong mark, and if you have things like the PSF does, then you have a great defense. But until something happens, it's not that big a deal, which is part of the education thing. People don't realize it until something happens. I hope that helps.
Thank you. So some more sort of community development advice here. Anthony asks, a lot of projects start out very small with 1 or 2 developers hacking on something that they want to use. Give your advice to open source developers. At what point in their project's lifespan do they really need to look seriously at joining a foundation or doing something else to support project needs that independent developers can't take care of themselves? Mike?
Right. Yeah, so my heuristic has always been when you start getting a significant number of users, then you start or adopters, and you have to start balancing the needs of the producers of the software versus the consumers of the software. Starting with 2 folks on GitHub is basically the canonical way to get started in open source, and it's perfectly fine. And it makes sense that your initial focus should be entirely around inspiring contributions and building a community around the code. And if you're successful, at some point, you're going to start getting adopters. And once you start getting adopters from enterprises, in particular, industrials, people are building real stuff with this. Then now you have sort of a conflict of interests between the folks that just want to focus on producing the code and the people that are consuming that code and want some of the additional safety, protection, reflection of their interest as consumers of that code. And that's really, I really think that's where the vendor neutral governance, the legal protections, the trademark protections, the infrastructure requirements, the community of practice that places like Apache and Eclipse have, I think that's really, that really comes into play at that point in time. And so I think it's often difficult for folks that started and put, sometimes years of energy into producing the code to realize that they've now hit a different point in their project lifecycle, and bringing it to a community foundation is the next logical step for the evolution of their project.
Chris, you want to say something?
No, I mean, Mike and I share very similar interests, so it's like I completely agree. Once you have multiple parties involved from different organizations, you have conflict potentially is there. You generally need kind of a level playing field instead of rules, and foundations act as a perfect place to do that. Other kind of indicators that come up if you need to raise money, starting to sign legal contracts, things get a little bit complicated there. And if you're not going I'm going to go start a company around this explicit project with a real legal entity and some kind of commercialization angle to it, a foundation is kind of a perfect place to kind of go to kind of make sure all your ducks are in a row.
Yeah, absolutely, Mike and Chris, spot on. And the only other suggestion is if if you and the 3 or 4 other people who are working in your projects, if you kind of think about this, if you write up a little governing doc, right? If you think about, hey, our name, our repo name, we use, that's our brand, right? If you start thinking about some of these things and you do a tiny bit of research and work on being organized about your project as a project, you can make it a lot longer, right? I mean, not longer in terms of when you have real adopters who are really pushing back on you, but that will go a long way towards helping you out be ready for when you do want to go to a foundation. You'll know, like, hey, we've already kind of thought of this governance structure, okay, now we can get real advice from people and they'll tell us the right place to go. Right, so thinking a little bit about this early will really help you along the way.
Okay, I'm going to have one person answer one other audience question, and then we're going to wrap up with final thoughts. So Daniel asked about artwork like logos, and is that covered by copyright or is that covered by trademark? And Van had some thoughts on that.
Okay.
So Van, did you want to just quickly explain that?
Yeah. I just needed to make sure that I went off of mute. So it's correct that both copyright and trademark can apply to something like a logo, particularly something that is like an image. However, they cover different sorts of things. Trademark is about the brand, whereas copyright, in this case, I'm going to talk about the image, is about the particular image. However, so what happens is under certain circumstances, there can be uses that are okay in copyright and not okay in trademark, and vice versa. For example, you can take a copyrighted logo and you can put it in a really offensive context, and that could be a new expression and okay under copyright, but but you can prohibit that under trademark because that is an issue for that really becomes an issue for your brand. So in most cases, the thing that you're going to want in terms of brand management is trademark, because copyright just doesn't give you the tools to deal with reputational type of issues.
Okay, well, thank you. So we're at the end of our time here, so we're going to wrap up with final thoughts from all of the panelists. Just briefly, because we only have 3 minutes left. So, Amy, do you want to lead off?
I'd just like to say I've learned a lot. As a community member who sits on a foundation board, this is a lot of in-depth information that I think is really helpful. Whether you're on a board or just a community member, just learning, the different processes and how many trademarks are out there and all the different classes. This was great.
Thank you. Mike?
I think this is a lot of great content for folks, and I hope people got a lot out of it. I think that the trademark law is an area where a lot of developers are just sort of undertrained or are missing some of the complexity of how difficult this can be. And I do think that trademark management is one of the services that foundations really bring to the table. And I just really encourage the listeners to think about getting this right earlier than later, because getting it wrong at the beginning can cause you, I can a whole other story there, but in Eclipse, it cost us like at least a decade of pain by getting it wrong at the beginning. So, yeah.
Okay, Van?
I would probably I'd probably emphasize what Mike just said. There's a real narrow window when it starts to make sense to spend money on this stuff. It doesn't make sense. You have just opened a new GitHub repo. You put in a README. That's not the time to file a trademark. On the other hand, relatively early in your project's life, it's worth starting to think about this and expand and investigating it, because it is one of those things where if you don't have it, you can really put yourself in a world of hurt, and you don't want to be in the case where you're where you're behind the 8 ball and you're trying to argue from behind.
Thanks, Chris.
Sure. Yeah, to echo everyone, taking care of this earlier, especially if your project is growing, is going to make a world of a difference for you. And, to be honest, there are so many fantastic open source foundations and organizations out there. Please support them, get involved. They've been around for, 20, 30 years protecting open source and kind of growing open source in general. So please get involved. There's many ways usually to get involved in these organizations, and they do a lot more work for your open source projects behind the scenes that you may not realize. So thank you, and please support all these awesome organizations out there.
Thank you. And finally, Shane.
I totally miss actually talking with all of you cool people, because we have great conversations, and this is important for us as well as for everybody listening. I'll be a contrarian at the end and say that the basics of how you present your project, right? Having a consistent brand, thinking about these things a little bit, right? You don't have to be an expert. Just read a couple of the guides. That is far more important than any of the legal bits until you get to the point where you're going to come talk to a foundation. So don't worry about the legal details until you've done the basics of, are we consistent with who we are? Have we thought about having governance and have what our brand is and what our name is? Actually think about that and present it well. Those are more important for any project really starting off, because the legal details will work out in the end, usually.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank all of our panelists. And again, thank you, the audience members who submitted questions, as well as people on social media who early on submitted questions. And for any of you who dialed in late, the video for this session will be up on Red Hat Community YouTube. You can get there from communitycentral.tv, and so that you can catch the part that you missed. So again, thank you, everyone, and we will have more community management content in the future.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Bye. Take care, all.
Take care.